I am going to hop around a lot. That's the only way that I've found that these things work for me, and I hope that they will be of interest to you the way I do hop around. But in the process of hopping around, I hope to touch on most of the things that would interest you about two things, the Office of Strategic Services and my duty in the Office of Strategic Services. But before I do that, I have to tell you that I did forget to bring one thing that I wanted very much to bring, cut out, put on the dining room table, where it still rests on the dining room table, and it said, the FBI is investigating the CIA, which I thought was a classic example of how screwed up things can get in the world of intelligence. And believe me, that is not a unique example. It's happened too often and has been taken care of one way or another, and will very probably keep right on happening. The collection of intelligence is no particular trick. The dissemination of intelligence is no particular trick, but using that intelligence properly is a trick that seems to be beyond the somewhat limited abilities of some of the people who get their hands on that intelligence. Having made that comment, I'll go on and tell you about the start of the Office of Strategic Services. It's a little hard to believe that with Europe ablaze in 1939, the United States had no intelligence service per se. They had the Office of Naval Intelligence, which took care of naval intelligence. They had G2, which took care of Army intelligence. State Department had theirs. FBI had theirs. That's all very interesting and sounds wonderful, except they didn't share this intelligence that they had with each other. In fact, they guarded it rather jealously and would not tell each other a great many things that they should have told each other. Well, President Roosevelt got a hold of that and said, he looked over in England and saw a really good intelligence system and said, what I'm going to do is find somebody who can go over to England, take a good look at their intelligence system, come back over here and make one of our own. I'll quote this. It's not the kind of language I use, but it's a quote, and I like the way it reads. In selecting World War I hero William Wild Bill Donovan as his coordinator of information in July of 1941, President Roosevelt chose an energetic civilian who shared his desire to do whatever it took to resist Nazism and the danger it posed to America. May we have a picture of General Donovan? There he is. If ever there was on this planet Earth someone who deserves to be on a stamp, there he is. And he's not on a stamp, and I understand there have been attempts to put him on it, but there are a lot of other people considered more important. Elvis Presley, Donald Duck, and this man, who probably did as much for the country as any one man ever did, is not on a stamp yet. If I do have an ambition in life, other than several that can't be mentioned in polite company, it's to get him on a stamp. President Roosevelt sent General Donovan to England in 1940 to study their intelligence system. The MI5 and MI6, both crack intelligence outfits, and the people that he sent him to talk to were brilliant men, both of them. One of them, Admiral John Godfrey, and the other one was a man that you've heard of. He's the man known as Intrepid. That was Sir William Stevenson. And between them, they showed Donovan the framework of what he could do if he came back home here and put it together, which the gentleman did. Incidentally, he got here his name, Wild Bill Donovan, for leading a bayonet charge in World War I that took care of something like a German battalion, and for that he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, after Pearl Harbor, which, as you all remember, was December the 7th, 1941, America entered into World War II. I had a kind of a personal thing about that. My dad was a naval officer, graduated from the Naval Academy in 1906. I was born and raised in Annapolis, Maryland, and I have far more Navy roots than I have Army, but I couldn't see well enough to get into the Navy. I could see well enough to get into the Army, and I could also see well enough to get into the Royal Canadian Air Force, who had the brilliant idea of letting you fly with your glasses built into your goggles. So we never got around to doing that, but in any event, my dearest friend, I guess people growing up always have one person they regard, mostly boys do this, girls do it too, I guess, but always have one that they call their pal, their real buddy, their best friend. And mine, the gentleman by the name of Harry Gaver, who was in the Marine Corps, enlisted in the Marine Corps, and he was killed aboard the Arkansas at Pearl Harbor. He'd risen through the ranks and was, at that time, a major. So I can still remember walking around in Annapolis on the day of Pearl Harbor. This is an example of what I mean by hopping around. I can remember walking around Annapolis the day of Pearl Harbor, and that whole town, the entire town of Annapolis, was simply in shock because of all the people that we'd lost, all close personal friends to a great many of us in that horrible day out there. Donovan came back, and in June of 1942, he formed something called Coordinator of Information, COI, which eventually was transmogrified through a couple of bridge units into what wound up as the Office of Strategic Services. If I might have slide 19, there he is. Again, America's first intelligence agency. There was a good book written, there have been a number of books written about the Office of Strategic Services, some better than others, and some not any good at all. But one of the better ones was written by Joseph and Stuart Alsop, Stuart Alsop and Thomas Braden, titled Sub Rosa, of course means underground. And this is a quote from them. OSS was a direct reflection of Donovan's character. He was its spark plug, the moving force behind it. In a sense, it can be said that Donovan was the OSS. Again, I'm hopping around. I wanted to tell you about the branches in the Office of Strategic Services. Seems like as good a time as any to do it. R&A, research and analysis, just exactly what it sounds like. R&D, research and development. And believe me, they developed some very unpleasant things to use against the Axis. MO, morale operations. MU, maritime unit. A lot of people don't realize that the OSS had a very good maritime unit, which used to take people in and put them ashore somewhere behind the lines, and very often brought them back out the same way. And that was MU. SI, secret intelligence, was just that. X2, counterintelligence, was supposed to be looking for moles and people that were didn't have our best interests at heart. And they functioned as a counterintelligence corps within the Office of Strategic Services would be a kind of a sweeping statement. Then two outfits, the operational groups, which consisted of usually 4 officers and 28 men, and their game was to go in behind the lines and not fight the Germans, but to organize local resistance units to fight the Germans, and in most cases to lead them into those kind of things like ambushes and blowing up bridges and destroying ammo dumps and things like that. They were not, in the strictest sense of the word, combat troops, in the sense that they fought the Germans head to head, but they caused the Germans an awful lot of trouble and were very highly regarded because of it. Then SO, Special Operations. Special Operations was the basic unit from which the fabled Jedburghs came. The Jedburghs consisted of teams of 3 men, an American Army officer, an officer from the country into which the operation was going, and a radio operator. And they were something, those boys. I trained a lot of them and knew a great many of them. And the name, oddly enough, came from a town in Scotland which got its reputation by building up a reputation for, we'll have the sentence first and then we'll have the trial. And on the basis of that, they figured the Jedburghs would operate just about the same way with the Germans, which is exactly what they did. My work in the OSS, if you could call it that, was I had some work in the operational groups. I was in 2 operational groups, and I was on 1 special operation. This is again a quote. The OSS recruited quick-thinking, creative men and women from a wide variety of places: Ivy League colleges, the military, Hollywood, and one of my best friends in the office, perfect example of what I'm talking about with hopping around. One of my better friends in the Office of Strategic Services was an expert safecracker who was on parole out of a prison in the Midwest because there simply wasn't anybody better than he was at breaking into safes where he wasn't supposed to go. And to this day, I don't know his real name. To me, he was always Antonio, called him Tony. And I can still remember the look of indignation on Antonio's face when he went into an embassy, opened a safe, brought out some papers, took them back outside, had them photographed, and said, well, I've done my job. And they said, oh, no, now you got to put them back. And he said, put them back? I don't put things back in safes. I only take things out of safes. He was really very indignant about the thought of having to put it back. They had to talk to him for about 20 minutes to get him to put these things back in so that nobody know they'd been taken. He was a good example of the kind of people that they had in the OSS. There were people that were familiar names. I think that some of them would be familiar to you. Julia Childs was one of our better people in the morale operations work. She was very, very good at it. Just as good in morale operations as she was as a cook. Nobody better. Mo Berg, the baseball player, spoke about 6 languages. Catcher for the Boston Red Sox. I never quite figured out why he had to speak 6 languages to say low and inside to a pitcher with a signal, but he was extremely highly regarded, did several operations, and wouldn't ever talk a bit about it. I never met him, but I met somebody who did, several people who did, said he was delightful, but he simply would not talk about what he had done in the war. John Ford, the director, very few, if any, as good, and certainly nobody better. He was in the Office of Strategic Services. Sterling Hayden, whom I always thought was a second-rate actor, turned out to be a first-class sailor, and he was very instrumental in taking men in from Italy and taking them across the whatever that strait is in there and landing them behind the lines, and a number of times he outran German PT boats, these things that were trying to chase people away, and the people that worked with him had very high regard for him. Never met him, but they said he was quite something. And then somebody named Jack Hemingway, who was Ernest Hemingway's son, and evidently did tremendous work in operations behind the lines, but was another one, and there were a number of them, who point blank refused to talk about it with anybody, and wouldn't listen. If somebody else started to talk about what he'd done, he'd just get up and walk out of the room. About me in the OSS, how I got in the OSS, left-handed if it ever happened. PVH Weems. Big one? Oh, there. Yeah, that reminds me of a song, believe it or not. One of my favorite folk songs has a line in it, "Long ago I used to be a young man." Well, there's a picture of it, and that's the truth. I could never understand why they didn't put that on the cover of the book. But anyway, PVH Weems founded the Weems system of navigation, and he lived in New York. I beg your pardon. He lived in Annapolis with my beloved father, my late father. And one day he and Dad bumped into each other, probably at the Officers Club in Annapolis Academy. And PVH said, "What's Roger doing these days?" And Dad said, "He seems to be having a rough time down in Louisiana. They've got him down there training troops, and he's having a hard time taking orders from people that he doesn't think deserve to be giving orders." It was a little hard for me. It was my fault. I'm prepared to admit it now. I wouldn't admit it then. But when Admiral William Halsey, to me, was Uncle Bill. Admiral Chester Nimitz, to me, was Uncle Chet. Now, when you have that kind of authority, and you know the men from whom that authority stemmed, and you realize the work that they've done, it's a little hard to listen to somebody who'd been in the Army about 20 minutes longer than I had, telling me to do something that I knew absolutely damn well was wrong. And I'd say so. Of a consequence, I was in trouble, right, left, and sideways. And I told Dad that, and he mentioned it to Weems. And the next thing you know, not that you know, but the next thing I know, I got a letter from my commanding officer, got a letter from George C. Marshall, who happened to be the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, to report for Washington for duty of, quote, "a secret and hazardous nature." And I didn't know what the hell that all meant. Didn't care. All it meant to me was getting it out of Louisiana and getting away from these people. One thing about Louisiana, I don't know how many of you have been there in the, shall we say, the warmer days, but there was an old line about Louisiana that I've always liked. It said, "It takes 2 alligators to last through the summer out in Louisiana." And that is a very good description of the climate down there. But got this letter, came back up to Washington, got into the OSS, and went out to train. I got to the station. I remember I'd lived in Annapolis, Maryland, and chased girls all over Washington, all during my college career. It got me in there, met me at the station, was met by another lieutenant, and he said, I said, "Where are we going?" We said, "We're going out to Area F." And I said, "Oh, that's nice. What's out there?" He said, "That's where you're going to be training." I said, "All right." So we drove around Washington, and then I realized all of a sudden, about 10 minutes, that this driver didn't have anything in mind. I don't know whether you've ever been to Washington, there's a lot of circles. They driving out around a circle and then down Connecticut Avenue. Then you come back up Connecticut Avenue. You go to Wisconsin Avenue, and you go around another circle. And I'd say, "Look, does he have anything in mind?" And he'd say, "Yeah, we're taking you out to Area F." I said, "Well, where is it?" He said, "Well, it's out this way." And I said, "Well, is it anywhere near the Congressional Country Club?" I thought he'd have a heart attack. He said, "What do you know about the Congressional Country Club?" I said, "Having spent half of my life out there playing tennis, and the other half carousing around with friends, I know a great deal about the Congressional Country Club." And the guy said, "Oh my God, we knew it would happen." I said, "You knew what would happen?" He said, "We knew that someday somebody would come along who was familiar with the Congressional Country Club." And I said, "You're not telling me that I'm going to be stationed at the Congressional Country Club outside of Washington as an instructor?" And he says, "That's exactly what I'm telling you." And I said, "Oh, this war is turning out to be better than I thought it might." And took me on out to Congressional Country Club and started in the course of training. Out there I met the fabled Major Fairbairn, who amongst other things taught me and everybody else that came through, including the fabled Jedburghs of whom I've mentioned, of whom I told you, how to kill with a folded newspaper. I'm not going to show you, but believe me, it can be done. You give me 2 sheets of paper from the New York Times, and I can fashion something that can put you away. And Fairbairn had a pocket full of tricks like that. They'd brought him over from England, and he was one of the ones that trained the Jedburghs and trained a great many people in the OSS in what became known as, I've never quite known where I don't think it deserves the noun, the art of silent killing. And we learned how to do that and a number of other things. It was during one of these training sessions, I've never been quite sure where along the line I met him, but I met then Captain Bill Colby, who later went on to become the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, one of the best they ever had. And he and I hit it off right away. Even though we had gone to Princeton, we got along very well. And he later put in a request for me to work with a group that was formed up with him as command. I'll tell you about that later on. In the process of having nothing to do at Area F, when there wasn't anybody to instruct, I got sent down to the parachute school at Fort Benning, Georgia, and became a parachutist, not a paratrooper. There is a big difference. Paratrooper is a soldier who parachutes out of airplanes and goes into combat. A parachutist, generally, particularly in the OSS, would be parachuted out of a plane just to get him on the ground to do whatever mission he'd been assigned to do. There were a number of, speaking of the OSS again, there were a number of what we used to call alphabet areas. You'd go from one to another, to another, to another. They had A, B, C, D, E. One of them is Camp David, which the president became the presidential retreat after the war. Beautiful place up in the something way mountains up around Haverty Grouse, in Maryland. Wore thin kind of quickly. I really thought I'd have more fun at Congressional Country Club. I didn't particularly care about like being an instructor, and I couldn't see any great future in it. All these people were coming through, and I was teaching them whatever Fairbairn had taught me to teach them. And then they'd go away, and then they'd bring in a new batch, and I'd keep saying, well, what's this all got to do with me? And then an operational group was formed. The Norwegian Special Operational Group was formed out of the 10th Mountain Division, which was at Camp Hale, Colorado, and they were basically Norwegians. And what they were going to do was go into Norway and try to interdict the line of supply coming down from the Russian German front, and came by sea. The British Navy made that as unpleasant as possible, and this Norwegian operational group was being formed to go in and try to cut the rail lines. And then my friend Colby, Bill Colby, whom I'd mentioned, said, I'm going to need 2 sections. I'll command one, and I'd like Roger Hall to command the other. I never, to this day, never got around to asking Bill why he picked me, but he did. We got along well. That had a lot to do with it. The 2 prime requisites for being a member of the operational group known as NORSO, Norwegian Special Operations, were fluency in Norwegian and an ability to ski. I didn't speak a word of Norwegian, and I don't even know how to put skis on. To this day, I don't know. But that's okay, because neither did Colby, and he was in command. So he was in command, and I was in the second part. Nothing specific to do in there waiting for the Norwegian Special Operations Group to get put together. So I said, look, why can't I go overseas and do something? And that doesn't, I don't mean to make that sound as heroic as it may sound, because the simple fact of the matter was that I was just getting bored silly sitting around in Area F, the Congressional Country Club. Granted, it was close to Washington. Granted, it was close to Annapolis. But I also knew that there were big things going on overseas, and I thought I'd like to get to be a part of them. All right, tell you what we'll do. We'll send you over to England, and while you're over there, you can go up to the British Parachute School. Would you like to go to the British Parachute School? And I said, not one damn bit. And they said, fine, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to go to the British Parachute School. And I said, why? And they said, well, the British have very cleverly figured out a way to get agents in behind the lines without them being detected on their way in, which is what was the troubling part of it. They were taking an old Whitley bombers, and the Whitley bombers were put in the regular bomber formations that flew over occupied Europe, and the parachutists went out of them and made their landings and got hooked up with the resistance groups. Now the tricky part of that was all the American parachute training that I had involved stepping out a door in the side of a plane. With the British Parachute School, which I became an instructor, you dropped through a hole in the bottom of the plane, which is, believe me, quite different from stepping out a door in the side. And they were having a great deal of trouble with the American and other nationals who came through the British Parachute School, because they didn't seem to get along too well with the British Parachute School instructors. And I said, well, that sounds like a job for me, because I'll just throw them right out of the plane. If they don't like it, that won't really matter to me, and it might not matter that much to them. So I went up to the British Parachute School and became an instructor, learned how to drop through the hole in the bottom of the plane, and as luck would have it, began to have an absolutely delightful affair with a beautiful parachute packer. Now, once you get in the parachute troops, you pay particular attention to whether or not you pack your own chute, which of course is ideal, and if you don't, you try to find out who did pack the chute that, as we say, you're going to jump. And this child was, this girl, I beg your pardon, this young lady, was Polish, and her name was Olga, and she and I got along famously, to put it mildly. And she used to give me my parachute every day that I went out. I didn't jump every day, but I made enough jumps so that Olga and I got to be pretty good friends. Now, at that time, when I was an instructor at the British Parachute School, the toughest men that I ever met during the war came through. A company of Polish paratroopers, Polish soldiers are what they were, who had become paratroopers. Now, I am talking about some hard articles. I read it, it's not my line, but I read a description of somebody else somewhere that fitted their commanding colonel, who I called Josie. Never did know his name. His name was, he almost had a zip code that went with just his name. But he had a face like a clenched fist, and that's exactly the way that man looked. He was the hardest article I met amongst the hardest articles I've ever met. He was the only officer I've ever seen actually strike a subordinate. This man had a collar unbuttoned during a review, and Josie went down the line looking at them before this other general who was going to review the troops came by, and he stopped in front of this one man who had an unbuttoned collar and just slapped him in the face just like that. And they didn't seem to think a thing of it. All I could think of was, if I ever did that to an American soldier, I'd be dead before I hit the ground. I mean, there were any number of people would have shot me in the back for less than that. So I used to stand out on the field as these Polish paratroopers were trained, and they'd jump, and Josie, Colonel Josie, would stand there. He was a bull of a guy, and he would yell at them as they came down in Polish. And the last thing that he always yelled, just seconds before they hit, was Nogi Razin. Now that's my pronunciation. I don't pretend to be able to speak Polish. Nogi Razin, Nogi Razin, Nogi Razin, over and over and over again. And one time he handed a megaphone to me and said, "Here, you try it." I went, "Nogi Razin, Nogi Razin." He said, "That's very good. You speak good Polish." I said, "No, first time I've ever heard that." So, Nogi Razin, Nogi Razin. Went back in the next day, got in line to get a parachute, was going to make a jump. And Olga, my beautiful parachute packer, had picked up a trick that used to send me out with starry eyes. Whenever she'd hand me my parachute, she'd push it forward, and then she'd put her hand right on top of mine and say, "Good luck today with your jump." I said, "Thank you very much, Olga." And then I found out later on she always used to come out and watch me jump, but I didn't know that then. Anyway, go through the line, get up to Olga. She hands me my parachute, puts her hand on mine, and I went, "Thank you, Olga. Nogi Razin." And she looked at me and her eyes turned into two slits. She said, "What did you say?" And I said, "Nogi Razin." And she jammed that parachute at me so hard it hit me right in the stomach, knocked the breath out of me. And the guy behind me said, come on, Lieutenant, move, got to get these guys out of here." So I went and pushed me on by and everything. I made my jump, came down near Colonel Josie, walked over to him, and I said, "Hey, this Nogi Razin that you're yelling." He said, "Yeah." I said, "What is it?" I thought it meant, to hell with Hitler, free Poland, up the army or anything. I had no notion what it meant. But as I said, I had just 4 minutes earlier said it to my beloved Olga. And I said, "Just what does Nogi Razin mean?" And he said, "Nogi Razin?" I said, "Yeah, they're yelling at these guys all the time, Nogi Razin. What does it mean?" He said, "Nogi Razin means keep your legs together." So I said, "Uh-huh." Next day, came back down to get a parachute for another jump. Olga wasn't there. She'd been transferred out, and I never saw her again. Sad story. Broke my heart. But I wanted to tell you a story about, as I said, perfect example of hopping around. Got nothing to do with anything I've said before. I wanted to tell you a story about a friend of mine, a late friend of mine, Douglas Bazata, B-A-Z-A-T-A, who claimed to be descended from Russian royalty, which I very much doubted. Very colorful guy, fearless, had been a Jedburgh. I'd helped train him. We'd gotten along well. And came back, told me, he didn't tell me the story. People who were with him told me the story. He was leading a very, very good French resistance group that was having a terrible time with a German tank that had positioned itself at a crossroads, just like that. And as such, it had command 360 degrees. Nobody came this way, nobody came that way. If they did, the Germans started shooting at them, simple as that. They knew the resistance people were in the area and figured a good way to control the area was to position this tank, which had machine guns and cannon and everything else, and they could wipe you out. Great big Tiger tanks were mean. So they told me later on that Doug came up, took a look at it. He spoke a number of languages, spoke fluent German, fluent French, talking to the leader of the French resistance group, and he said, "You got to get that tank out of there." And the Frenchman said, "Yeah, got any ideas?" Doug said, yes, as a matter of fact, I do have an idea. He said, get me a set of French peasant clothing. He was dressed in stuff we use behind the lines, just drab OD stuff. So he didn't look like anything but what he was, an American guerrilla leader. So they went back and got him some clothes, dressed him all up, made him look like a Frenchman. And he said, now get me a package of papers, just a stack of papers. I don't care what they are. Just something that looks like a bunch of mail or papers or something like that. I said, all right, gave him that. And but Doug, who was absolutely fearless, had his outfit on, strolled out down the road, right towards this German tank. The minute he started down the road, around comes the machine gun pointed right straight at him. And Doug just waves one hand at him, walked right straight up to the tank, hammered on the side of it, bang, 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 said one word in perfect German, mail, M-A-I-L, mail. The minute he said it, turret of the tank opened, turret top tank opened, Doug lobbed in 2 hand grenades, dropped to the ground, boom, wiped out the tank. The resistance group took off from then, and that's how Doug Bazata got his Distinguished Service Cross, which was the second highest medal to our Army awards. But he was typical of the breed that they had in the OSS. I don't mean to infer or imply from I don't know the difference between those two verbs. I would never have thought of doing that, and if I'd thought of it, I for damn sure wouldn't have done it. But Doug did it and brought it off. By now, the Asian Operational Group was getting into pretty good shape, so they sent Colby in with Norso 1. I was in Norso 2 to follow him. Norso 1 had functioned in France as a group and had done extremely well. Norso 2 had never really done anything because they hadn't been asked to do anything. And they had another officer who, well, to put it politely, hadn't worked out very well, and I was his replacement as the head of Norso Group 2. And as I said, the mission for both Norwegian operational groups was to keep the Germans from coming down from the Russian front down by land and getting together with the Russians who were going to make Europe, their Festung Europe, or whatever they call it, their last stand. There was a slot. Oh yeah, there it is. That is Norso Group 2 marching over to accept the surrender of the German troops at Verness Airfield. You can see from that slide that they are very good looking, very military, very well trained, and it's completely misleading. They were excellent guerrilla fighters. Every man in that outfit's fearless, with the possible exception of the gentleman on the right. But I've always liked that picture, and it was also one of Bill Colby's pictures. I've never quite known why. Yeah. If I might have slide 13. Oh yeah. This raffish group. We were trying to join up with Colby, who was already in Norway. We were going, we thought, to drop in with him. Instead, the navigators, who seemed to make a habit of doing, ended up landing us in Sweden. So the boys that you're looking at in that picture all got to Norway by the simple process of marching across the border from Norway into Sweden. But, beg your pardon? Yeah. They went from Sweden into Norway. We were, as a matter of fact, we were damn near interned. I never got the point of that. They said, oh, we could intern you. I said, well, what would that accomplish? And they said, nothing, but wouldn't you like to be interned? I said, no, I don't want to be interned. And neither do any of my men. And if you want us to have to shoot our way out of here, we can do that too. But that's, you're looking at some hard articles there, a possible exception of the one gentleman in the front left. At Verness Airfield, which is where there were about, give or take 8,000 to 10,000 German troops who had never been defeated in combat. They had come back down from the Russian front, retreating all the way under orders. But there was also, at that place, about 20,000 Russian prisoners of war whom they treated almost literally like animals, and they are the ones who had built Verness Airfield. Do I have another slide here? Yeah, that's it. That is a German airplane that I brought down with one single shot from a 45. And if you'll believe that, you'll believe anything. But Verness was full of those things, and they, in their time, had done a considerable amount of damage. Of a consequence, the capture of the airfield was important. And I was there with 6, count them, 6 men. The ones who were supposed to go to Norway with Colby, and instead had gone to Sweden, and then we marched across the border and got up to Verness. So the men who were with me and I decided that, we got orders actually, accept the surrender from the German officer in command. Well, the German officer in command turned out to be about 5 feet 3, and he had 2 iron crosses. He walked with a bad limp, and we were under orders not to salute or return their salutes, and not under any circumstances to shake hands with them. And I was all for that, in my opinion, of those people being what it was. So the German officer came up, and they said that he would not surrender to me because he was a full colonel and I was a lowly second lieutenant. And I said, that's fine. Where is he? And they said, he's over there in that house over there by the something or other. I said, fine. Tell him if he's not out of that house in 5 minutes, we're going to burn it to the ground with phosphorus grenades, and if he's in it, too bad. And at that point, my supply sergeant came up and whispered to me, we don't have any phosphorus grenades. And I said, that's all right, he'll be right over, you watch. And he was. He scooted right over. And he came over, and he made this big speech in German, which I do not speak at all. But I had several people right beside me who did speak German. And I said, what the hell is he talking about? And he said, he's making a big speech about Germany is like the dagger in his sheath, in his scabbard. He had a beautiful dagger hanging from his hip. And I said, really? I said, tell him to give me the dagger. Stop talking and give me the dagger. So he did, handed it to me. Hilt first, thank God. And I put it on the ground, stepped on it, broke the blade. And that went over real big with all the Norwegians around. Oh, they just thought that was great. And I really thought that man, who was in his way a warrior and a brave one, I really thought he was going to have an apoplectic stroke. He turned 14 shades of red and started to talk, but he was so angry that he started to stutter. I said, well, I couldn't understand him in German. I really can't understand him now. So tell him to stop bothering me and let's get on with his surrender. And then I said, and tell him that if he and his men don't behave themselves very, very well, I'm going to turn those 20,000 Russian prisoners of war they've been mistreating for 3 years loose on them. And believe me, some of those men would have been more than happy to tear any German they could get their hands on limb from limb. And I speak literally when I say limb from limb. The only way I could keep them in line was telling them that we were in charge of the food, and we'd see that they got good food and were treated properly, and they bought that. So, yeah, there's another slide in there. Oh, there it is. Somebody got word around to one of my men that a one star in the American Army meant a general. So they painted that on my, that's a Volkswagen, the first one I ever saw. And that was my private conveyance all around that part of Norway. And everybody seeing the star would practically stand on their head and come to attention when I came by, because they thought, oh my God, here comes an American general. So I had a great time with that. And the north, next slide, yeah, those are the ones that went to Sweden with me, and we were supposed to go into Norway, and we got to Norway on foot. And believe me, we heard a lot about that from our comrades in arms, all of whom had made the jump into Norway. And they said, well, about time you got here. Sorry it took you so long to walk this far, but two gentlemen all the way to the left and all the way to the right are the crew of the plane. And they were the ones actually that may have preserved my life without my even knowing it, because I understand that, well, my back was to them. I was talking to this little German who was giving me a hard time. The whole time that was going on, the forward turret gunner in this bomber, American bomber that was going over, had these 4 machine guns trained right smack on the Germans. And they knew that if anything got out of line, that was well within his capabilities to blow them all away with one short burst. Again, hopping around. Norso group at the Baroness Airfield, told you about that. I want to talk to you about the book. I want to make sure to get this in, because it's one of my favorite anecdotes about the Office of Strategic Services and my book about the Office of Strategic Services, which of course was known as the Cloak and Dagger outfit, which it was more cloak than dagger. But on the first day that they brought, this is a story that happened to a friend of mine, St. George Bryan, was recruited into the Central Intelligence Agency. Very bright young man. Still in it, to the best of my knowledge. And he said that the first day that I went in there, the first thing that they talked about was this sort of a welcome to the outfit kind of a lecture. But during that, the person who was doing this kind of a reception speech held up a copy of my book like this. And St. George came this close to saying, hey, I know the guy that wrote that, he's a good friend of mine, but he didn't, which was fortunate, because what happened when this man held up a copy of my book is, first and foremost, gentlemen, we don't want this to ever happen again. So it's a good thing St. George didn't mention what a good friend he was of mine. He'd have been probably taken out and shot right then and there. Now, about the book, which I always enjoy talking about, that book is currently in its 17th printing. Now, any of you who might have it in mind to write a book, I can offer you this in the way of encouragement. The book that is currently in its 17th printing was turned down by 11, count them, 11 publishers. And a lot of people thought that nobody's interested in World War II, which is ridiculous, and nobody's interested in the Office of Strategic Service, which is ridiculous. And it's done extremely well. and has now come out in a paperback edition, the one that I just held up, printed by, of all people, the Naval Institute Press. I've still never figured out quite how the hell my book about me and the Army got into the Naval Institute Press, but I was very, very glad to see it. I also know, I want to tell you about the cover. They called me up after the book had been accepted, called me up and said, come on down, we got some book jackets I want to show you, see which one you like. Went down there, they had them on a table, 4 of them out like that. And I looked at them, and they said, what do you think? I said, I think they are awful. And I heard the publisher, my dear friend, the late George Brockway, one of the best publishers that ever walked, he said, I knew he'd say that. I said, George, these are terrible. They don't say anything about the book. They don't say anything about the humor. They don't say anything about the facts. They don't say anything about the OSS. They don't say anything. And he said, well, he said, I suppose you think you can do better. I said, no, I can't, but I just might know somebody who can. At the time, I was living on West 53rd Street in a sublet of a sublet, and the sublet, the original sublet, belonged to the best commercial artist in New York, the late Sol Ehrlich, who was about as good as they got at that game. And he had read my manuscripts at least months before that. Going into the building, bumped into him on the hallway. I said, hey, Sol, you remember that book of mine, that manuscript? He said, yeah, how's that doing? I said, pretty good. Been accepted, but we're having trouble with a jacket. You think you could come up with a jacket? He said, well, I could give it a whack. Next morning, as I stumble in to get my tea, there's a manila envelope, one of those 9 by 12 jobs, under the door. Pick it up, open it up, there's the book jacket. Called up W.W. Norton, my publishers. I said, get that collection of incompetence that you call an editorial board together, and I want to bring down the jacket to my book. They said, all right, that's fair. They did. I walked in. I said, gentlemen, tried to put a little drama in it, put it down, and said, did I do that? Somebody throw that at me? Sorry. I said, here's the jacket for the book. Put it on the desk. These people looked at it and they go, wow, boy, that's great. Damn, that's a great jacket. That's going to sell, blah, 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 blah. And they said, you do that? And I said, no. And they said, well, who in the world put together that jacket? I said, my landlord. That went over big. They said, your landlord? I said, yeah, Sol Ehrlich. Sol, after that, became a contract jacket man for them, and did a number of very well-known book jackets, but he was always, almost to the last day I saw that fine man, he was always proudest of this one. And I got a call once from the book fair out in Chicago, which was a big deal. Everybody's out there, all the books, blah, blah. And didn't have the manuscript, but they took the jacket out, stuck it up on a cardboard board, which had a lot of jackets on it. Got a call from my late editor, Eric Swenson, another one, is as good as they got. And they said, I'd never heard the expression, I don't know why, considering all the time I hung around racetracks. He said, your book is showing surprising early foot. I said, what's that supposed to mean? He said, it's doing very well. I said, oh, have you got the manuscript out there? He said, no, we don't have the manuscript, it's the jacket that's doing very well. I said, well, that's all right with me. I don't really care what sells. If the jacket does, more power to it. And somebody said to me, how did you ever come up with that title? I said, a combination of 2 things. Years and years ago, I don't think there's anybody here who could remember it, there was a New Yorker magazine cartoon, young lady standing in the aisle of a motion picture theater, bending over slightly and saying to a man who's sitting in the aisle seat, pardon me, but you're sitting on my eyelashes. Now, I'd never known why, but that always amused the hell out of me, and I transmogrified that and stepping on that German officer's dagger into you're stepping on my cloak and dagger. Now, which brings us to, have we done all the pictures?
No, there's one more. You could pick that up. Yeah, there.
Where? Oh yeah, this is my beloved wife, who knows far more about these things than I do, says that that poster is or was at a big reunion that we missed, sob, because I had a detached retina and couldn't travel. And it is supposed to have a great many pictures of a great many people in the Office of Strategic Services in those various things. There's a couple in there that involve my group and some that don't involve my group. But I've never seen that poster, but Linda says, who has seen it, says that it's a beauty. Oh boy, too long. I knew it. Huh? Yeah. You can see who runs this family. Although you should have seen, she's the only person I ever knew that got lost 3 times driving down Old York Road. I tried to get into one library, but there is an, incidentally, my book has the structure of the OSS in it, but if you want to know how the OSS was actually structured and put together and all that thing, there's an excellent book. I don't know why I mentioned this guy's name. I'll tell you why in a moment. Name is Patrick Forrester. Oh, I beg your pardon, O'Donnell, I can't get his name right. And the title of it is quite clever. OSS, Operators, Spies, and Saboteurs. Quite clever. I hate him. Now, he did not mention my book in his book. That's why I hate him. I forgot it. That's why I don't. Anyway, he has a closing paragraph which I like to read. It's far better than anything I could ever write about that sort of thing. And this is a quote from that book of Patrick's. Incidentally, about the demise of the OSS was put out of business very abruptly by the one man that I have ever heard who did not practically revere General Donovan, and that was Harry Truman. He didn't get along with Donovan at all, and he abolished the OSS, just as simple as that. He abolished the OSS on October the 1st of 40-something or other, 45. And if it hadn't been for one they call Buffalo Bill Quinn, who grabbed half the records, and Donovan himself, who grabbed the other half, we wouldn't have the record that we do of the OSS and what went on in it. And it in turn transmogrified into the SSU, which was Strategic Service Unit, which then went on to become the Central Intelligence Agency. And as I said, currently being investigated by the FBI. But anyway, I would like to close with this. On Sunday, February the 8th, 1959, Donovan passed away. At his side was his Dominican-robed brother, who administered the last rites. When President Eisenhower heard the news, he said to have remarked, "We have lost the last hero. The heroes of World War II and the OSS are slowly fading away, but their legacy remains." I enjoyed talking to you. I'd like to do this, but I've been told it was a good idea to do it. Does anyone have any questions that I might be able to answer?
Just one moment. We're going to do what we've done in the past. If you have a question, raise your hand and make sure it's one question, not one of these that'll transmogrify into 5 or 6. Okay?
Where'd you get that
Any
word?
questions?
President Dean. You hear me?
Yeah, it's fine.
I wondered why in the beginning they didn't call it ASS, American Secret Service.
Oh,
You got it going on pretty big.
That would be beautiful.
I don't even need to answer that.
That's a good first one.
Yeah. Well, I hope the next one's better.
Any other questions?
One's enough.
Over here. Anybody over here?
I killed it.
Any questions over here? How about up
They're
here?
all asleep.
Okay. Well, that did it.
Step with me always for that.
Fair enough. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much. Before we leave, I just would like to tell you I'm wearing a uniform that is worn by the tour guides at the museum up at the Naval Air Station. It's open Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday, 10 to 5. And you get an opportunity to see a collection of World War II airplanes, Navy, Army, and so forth.
That's 4-0.
And you'll also see a German Me-262 and the first American jet. So, despite what you read about it being closed, we're open, we're moving ahead, and we're going to be there for a long time. So if you have the time, stop up and see us.
That's worth making a trip up to see us. Good. Very good.
If you're interested in Roger's book, the library does not let us sell books here, but the books will be coming from Roger Hall and his wife from their home, and he'll inscribe it for you. Yeah, we can be shady and we have 10 books for sale here. We can sell them outside of the library, but we can't sell them in here. So if you're interested in his book, we can do this outside, or you can. There's a flyer for the book in the back. You'll be sending money to Roger, and he'll inscribe it and send it back to you. All right. Thank you. Yes. Oh, we have a question. One question.
I didn't think of it earlier. What did you do after you got out of the OSS?
I became a sports broadcaster at WBMD. There's one part of my career that I skip over. I wouldn't tell this to everybody, but you're good friends of mine. I'm sitting here, I'm comfortable. I worked for 6 halcyon weeks for the National Rifle Association, and I did everything I could to screw them up, and finally left under duress. Then got a job broadcasting in the press box of the Baltimore Colts, who at that time were in the American Football League. Went from there into radio broadcasting in Baltimore, and was on radio station WBMD, and I was something less than well beloved because I had a bad habit. I was told it was a bad habit. I always thought it was a good habit. I was saying, good afternoon. Oh, this is Roger Hall in the Hall of Records. No requests. I play what I like. And that went over big with some people, but not too big with a lot of people. So my career in broadcasting was such that I've decided that the best way to get out of it was to write a book, which is how Cloak and Dagger got to be gotten. And as I told you, from then on, it was simply a question of finding a publisher with enough intelligence to buy it, which they finally did.
And you wrote 2 other books.
Oh, I've written 2 other books. I've forgotten their name. What are they any good?
All My Pretty Ones.
All My Pretty Ones is about high fashion models, and 19, which has suddenly become quite popular again, is about an intelligence organization operating within the Central Intelligence Organization. And all of a sudden it begins to look like I know what I'm talking about, which I don't. But since then, writing has always been the main chance, always will be. But as I said once, made the mistake of saying at a very distinguished panel, of every one of whom was a name writer, I said, writing is hard, lonely work. And they're all nodding their heads. And I said, but it sure in hell beats getting up in the morning. So that's the way I ended that.
And on your way out, just please keep in mind we need donations for the program. Thank you. See you next month.
My God. I found that.
Major Parker was in charge of the crossroads, and he recruited some other units around to help protect this important roadway. And for like 4 days, they held off incredible German attacks. I mean, wave after wave of German attacks came at them. A lot of my friends were there. A guy named Frank Tacker, who was a sergeant, who was just a wonderful friend to me. He was seen firing these multiple machine guns. He was captured. Another friend of mine who I met later, I didn't know he was there then, John Gatens was captured. Ed Brown, my friend, was captured. So they eventually overran it, and John Gatens told me the story that after they were out, they were out of ammunition. The German tank drove up, put his muzzle through the door of this building. It was like a little cafe and roadside inn, and said in perfect English, "Do you surrender, or do you want me to kill all of you?" And they surrendered, and they became prisoners. Some of them got through. A good friend of mine named Randy Pearson got through, and he says he doesn't know how he made it because they shot at him and he got phosphorus burns from a phosphorus shell, and he got through. And then they rejoined the rest of the battalion at this chateau. And on December 31st, New Year's Eve, Sergeant Palfy went out and he traded a pair of combat boots for a bottle of cognac. And he came back, and we were in the building, and Sergeant Webb, we'd gotten a kitchen unit that we lit up, and we all took swigs out of the bottle, and we all swore that next year would be it would be better, which it was. But the next day we were assembled. Oh, and the rumor was that they were going to send in new replacements to build up the 589th, because we had no guns, we had no pieces, no artillery pieces, and there were, out of 504 men in our battalion, there are only 92 of us left. So they said, well, we're going to send in, we're going to reconstitute you. Then that next day, though, with Major Goldstein came out and said they decided to disband the unit, and we would be sent to different outfits who were still around. So most of us, myself, Aspinwall, a number of others, were sent to the 592nd, and that's where we stayed from then on till the end of the war. But that, in effect, ends the story of this part of the Bulge for me. So maybe some other time I'll tell you what happened afterward, but I appreciate your attention, and thank you very much. I'll take any questions that you might want to answer. Ask. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to know how far was St. Vith from Bastogne?
About, I was going to say maybe 70 miles, some down. Bastogne would be, oh, I don't have the map now. Bastogne would be way south of where we were, down here, yeah, down there. George, you want to?
Yes. Next question, over here. Back here. Just a moment.
Wasn't your position also the location of the Malmedy massacre?
Yeah, yeah. The Malmedy massacre happened, I remember, I think it was December the 18th. This is Pfeiffer, who was the commanding general of an SS division, and the SS were bastards, plain out and simple. They surrounded a group of our guys, and they deliberately opened up machine guns and killed all of them. I think there was something like 75 or 76 men killed, just massacred there, and it was horrible. But what that did is, when that word got around, every guy said, I don't know if it was an act of heroics or something, but you said to yourself, well, I'm keeping one bullet. I'm not going to, if it comes to that, we're not going to do it. So that stiffened the resolve of the guys on the ground, and that was and I think in retrospect it was a bad mistake on their part, because every unit said, that's not going to happen to us. We'll go to the last guy. By the way, I should also mention to you, in Parker's Crossroads, that technique, it's now called the Alamo Defense, and it's now taught at West Point, based on what the 589, what they did at that crossroads. And there's a whole article in this magazine. This magazine is our publication, comes out 4 times a year. And there's a whole story in here about this Alamo Defense and how it's taught at West Point. And there's also a picture of a number of us, including me, and that's Randy Pearson, and that's our sergeant. Randy Pearson was given a battlefield commission, and later on, much later on, I almost had him killed. I took him, they said, oh, this is when we were pulled back off the line and into France, and he had to go to division headquarters to get, or corps headquarters, wherever it was, to get his official lieutenant's bars and all that stuff and swearing in. So I volunteered to drive him because he was a good friend of mine. And they said, well, okay, what did we take? I said, well, what Jeep should I? They said, take the mailman's Jeep. Wrong. In the Army, never used a mailman's Jeep because it was never serviced. So now on top of that, we had a young French boy who was doing a lot of work, KP and all that kind of stuff. And he lived near the town where we were going with Randy. And he asked if he could go with us. I said, sure, that's illegal. We were not allowed to do that. So Randy's sitting next to me, I'm driving, and this young man is in the back, and we're going down. I wasn't going particularly fast. I mean, maybe I'm going 30, 35, no traffic. Suddenly, the Jeep bounces on these 2 legs here, bounces back this way. I'm trying to righten it, comes back this way and flips us over. And all 3 of us go sliding along this road. My first thought was, the kid gets killed, I'm in a lot of trouble. And thank God he was fine. We got very badly cut up, bruised up on knees, and my eye bruised, and Randy was beat. His new uniform was torn. Later on, much later on, he sent me a cartoon that another guy had driven, and the caption is, "Fish, what are you trying to do, kill me?" So, yeah, any other questions? Yes?
Just a comment about your frozen feet. Part of my service was bringing casualties back. I made 8 trips from France and England, bringing casualties back to this country. And a significant number were what we call trench foot, amputated feet. It was a tremendous number.
Wow.
Right at the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
It was one of the most significant injuries that we're bringing back at that time.
Say that again, because some people missed that.
Now, I'm just saying that part of
Use the mic, use the mic.
part of my duty,
It's okay, you're on.
okay.
part of my duty was to bring, part of my service, casualties back from France at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, and a significant number of the wounded we brought back had what we call trench foot. And these were mostly guys that had their feet amputated because they were in the cold and trenches and their feet were frozen and they didn't change their socks. And when Sam told you how his feet were, it brought back that part of my service.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Anybody?
Mr. Feinberg,
Yes,
I
sir.
want to commend you on your memory. Brings back a lot of mine. I happen to be in the cannon company, 424th Infantry.
Wow, wow.
We were a little south of you.
You were south, yeah, yeah. You guys were in reserve. They held you in reserve for a
We were
while.
up right on the line.
Yeah, oh, then they moved you up, yeah, yeah, yeah.
We moved in for the 2nd Infantry.
Oh, you moved near, oh, yeah, because they were also
They
sent
moved
back to,
out
yeah,
and moved
yeah,
in.
yeah. We needed all the help we could get at that point, believe me. That's great. Anybody else? Any other questions? By the way,
questions?
I should have also said this. The battalion was presented with the French Croix de Guerre, and it was the only battalion that was so honored. And the interesting little side note to that was the order was signed by Bidault, who later became the Premier of France. He was the Minister of War at that point, but we were given this Croix de Guerre, which was good because when we went on leave later on, and we went to Nice and so forth, couldn't buy a drink. You could walk in and anything you wanted on the house. You couldn't pay for it. It was, it was interesting. By the way, you're welcome to come up here as some stuff.
Thank you for
Okay, a question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Brought back memories. Where did you pick up your ordnance in England? What?
Okay. I don't.
Where was it?
I don't know the exact.
Cheltenham, G25. The largest
Cheltenham sounds familiar.
largest ordnance depot in England.
That may have been it. I still to this day can remember. It's as far as your eye could see. You could see howitzers lined up. I mean, incredible. Yeah, it must have been. Yeah.
Largest depot in England.
Is that right? Interesting. I got to remember that. Okay, thank you.
G25.
Thank you.